Everyone knows about World War II, but you don't know everything. Here are 50 insane facts about the largest war in human history. In the 1930s, the world was still scarred by the brutal First World War. Few Western nations wanted any part of another future conflict, but they wouldn't have a choice. The future Axis powers were already brewing plans, and Japan made its move in 1937. The Sino-Japanese War raised many eyes around the world about how ambitious Japan actually was. Germany was in no state to think about another war in the 1930s. The devastating economic fallout after their loss was used by the Nazis as motivation. While Hitler rolled out the PR offensive with one hand, he was also arming up. The 1930s were a time of heavy investment in the military for the Nazis. When they started their march, everyone was surprised by just how powerful they had gotten. The National Socialist Party wasn't originally called the Nazis. They called themselves the Nazos. The term Nazi was coined by journalist Konrad Haydn from a Bavarian word meaning stupid. The Nazis somehow didn't notice this insult, but not everything about them was originally evil. The swastika became a symbol of evil, horrifying those for whom it had a different meaning. The swastika began as an ancient religious symbol, meaning fertility and good fortune worldwide. Many who used it in religious rites have called for its removal due to painful associations. As war grew closer, British engineer Robert Watson-Watt investigated rumors of a Nazi death ray. Watson-Watt determined it was impossible. But his research led to quantum leaps in radar technology. European governments were desperate to avoid war, so they made several concessions to Hitler. The most significant concessions came from Czechoslovakia, whose leadership wasn't even invited to the summit. Hitler promised to abide by the treaty terms, up until the moment he didn't. The last straw was when Hitler invaded Poland, crossing Britain's red line on September 3rd. Britain declared war on Germany, starting World War II. But did Britain itself have a hand in it? Historians have debated Neville Chamberlain's legacy, whose name became synonymous with surrender and appeasement. His detractors say he gave away the store, while defenders say he acted in good faith. The verdict then was swift. Chamberlain was ousted and replaced by Winston Churchill as Prime Minister. Hitler had been planning for war long before, signing a dark pact with Joseph Stalin. The two countries signed a non-aggression pact, detailing how they would divide up Eastern Europe. Like most things with Hitler, the pact couldn't be trusted for long, but for now, war wasn't much of a war. Poland fought hard at the start, but they were fighting two much larger, better-equipped nations. In September and October 1939 alone, Poland saw 70,000 soldiers killed and 500,000 captured. The fight against the Russians on the other front was just as bad for Poland. Poland lost 50,000 men on their eastern front, while the Russians lost less than 1,000. Britain declared war on Germany after the invasion, but the front was far away, and early moves were uninspiring. The Royal Air Force mostly dropped propaganda leaflets over Germany in what became known as the Phony War. Both in Britain and America, many people wanted no part of another war and advocated for isolationism. But it wasn't all wins for Germany and its allies right away, as Russia invaded Finland. This would have given Russia a beachhead in Scandinavia and a massive strategic advantage, but Finland had another idea. Their well-trained army knew the snowy region and had some of the best snipers in the world. It wasn't long before the Soviets were on the run, leading to their expulsion from the League of Nations. However, Soviet persistence would eventually lead to Finland signing a peace settlement and giving up territory. But the biggest front yet in World War II was about to launch with Hitler's invasion of France. Hitler crossed the Maginot Line in 1940, and German forces advanced into France through Luxembourg and Belgium. German troops overwhelmed the French forces using armored vehicles and planes to gain territory in a hurry. It led to one of the biggest refugee crises in history, with chaos at Dunkirk. With German troops advancing fast, Allied command decided they had to evacuate British soldiers stationed in northern France. There weren't enough boats, and the army's capabilities were limited, with German troops trapping forces on the mainland. The evacuation effort would eventually be known as the Miracle of Dunkirk because of what happened next. Over 8 days, over 300,000 troops were evacuated on a fleet of over 800 vessels. Many of them were civilian ships volunteering for the rescue, making it truly miraculous and heroic. But the crisis was only beginning, as France, Belgium, and the Netherlands all fell quickly to Nazi invasion. This led to a massive influx of refugees fleeing Nazi tyranny, with over 8 million civilians displaced. Many wound up in displaced person camps struggling to survive, though some were eager to enlist and fight back. As the Nazis marched across Europe, things on the home front weren't any better for those under occupation. Hitler was a narcissist who wanted to be praised everywhere, even demanding his picture replace Jesus in schools. Hitler's persecution of Catholics intensified, and he even consulted about occupying Vatican City and killing the Pope. The general was so shocked, he tipped off the Italians instead, preventing the attack on Vatican City. Hitler had an interest in weakening Britain's economy by causing hyperinflation with an unlikely weapon, counterfeit cash. He enlisted prisoners at a concentration camp, creating $132 million worth of fake British pounds. When introduced to the British economy, it caused brief fluctuations, but not the total chaos Hitler hoped for. Hitler was obsessed with German culture purity, cracking down on any expression he deemed degenerate art. Books were burned en masse, and creators of art thought unpatriotic were arrested by the Nazi regime. Connoisseurs were displeased, so Hitler held an exhibition of banned art called Degenerate Art to shock people. A massive collection of over 650 works were displayed, and the public came in huge numbers to see it. Far more people visited than the approved Nazi art galleries, completely embarrassing Hitler's propaganda campaign. Hitler was also fixated on race purity, plastering propaganda posters with images of blonde, blue-eyed children. This was ironic given that Hitler was a dark-haired Austrian, but no one was going to tell him that. He even started a campaign in 1935 to find the perfect Aryan baby as a symbol of the country. His propaganda minister Goebbels was put in charge and oddly chose a brunette child for the campaign. The photo was submitted by Hans Bahlen, an anti-Nazi activist who submitted a picture of a Jewish child to sabotage the campaign. It worked a little too well, as the girl's family had to flee to Latvia to escape Nazi persecution. Art had a powerful impact on those campaigning against the Nazis, especially across the Atlantic Ocean. Across the Atlantic, the thought of getting involved in World War II wasn't very popular in America. The United States had a strong isolationist bent, and many people campaigned against any intervention in Europe. The news media wasn't covering many of Hitler's atrocities, and those trying to raise attention didn't have much luck. But there was one exception. The legendary silent film star Charlie Chaplin, who became an anti-Nazi activist. The anti-Nazi activist had no luck getting studios to fund his satire, The Great Dictator, so he funded it himself. At great personal cost, Chaplin made the film, and Hitler was reportedly not pleased to be portrayed as a buffoon. But a far bigger name was working the other side, the famous pilot Charles Lindbergh, championing isolationism. Many people tried to convince him to run against President Roosevelt in 1940, with polls showing he was the Republicans' best candidate. He eventually decided against a run, but the war was about to intensify and bring in new fronts. After the fall of France, Nazi Germany turned their attention towards Britain with a massive air campaign. A ground invasion would have been challenging, so Hitler focused on bombarding the British into surrender from the air. But that turned out more difficult than expected, thanks to the Dowding system created by RAF commander Hugh Dowding. This system set up reporting that let the British respond to air attacks faster, streamlining information between ground and air. This would foil many Nazi attacks, but it couldn't foil all of them as the Blitz hit London. As the Blitz hit London and other English cities, everyone had a role to play to ensure their survival. Many men went off to war, while women took on their old responsibilities, and children were sent to the countryside. Parents sent their children to live in the countryside for the duration of the bombing with relatives or willing host families. This was famously the setup for the C.S. Lewis novel, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. But Britain looked like a heavy underdog at first with far fewer aircraft than the German Luftwaffe. Britain had around 3,700 planes total, with less than half being high-speed fighter aircraft. By comparison, the Luftwaffe had almost 4,200 total aircraft, including over 1,000 fighter planes and bombers. This allowed them to hit Great Britain more frequently, hoping to pound them into submission with constant attacks. The reality, though, was rather different, as Britain's defense systems were far more accurate than Germany's attacks. Ultimately, they survived the attack and persisted while Germany suffered far heavier losses in the Battle of Britain. While the British lost over 1,500 aircraft and over 500 air crew, the Axis forces lost hundreds more planes. The Axis forces also suffered over 3,000 dead, and the war was about to change again, dramatically. It was mid-1941, and the German bombing of Britain had failed to cause the nation's surrender. So, naturally, the perfect thing for Hitler to do was open up a huge and brutal new front by invading the Soviet Union. On June 22, 1941, German forces invaded the Soviet Union in Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's biggest blunder. Why did Hitler decide to take this risk? It was all about his obsession with race and Lebensraum. Russia had a lot of land, and Hitler thought it would be great real estate to fill with German citizens instead of Russians. And it wasn't the only time Hitler picked a fight he didn't need, as he would later declare war on America. It was the most famous moment of the war, a day of infamy when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. The Japanese forces attacked to deter the United States from interfering in their conquests in the Pacific region. The attack devastated the United States naval fleet, and the U.S. immediately declared war on Japan in retaliation. Those advocating against war switched their strategy to urging the U.S. to stay out of the European front entirely. But they wouldn't have that chance because Germany declared war on the United States in solidarity with Japan. And just like that, Hitler had made himself another enemy that would arrive on the European battlefield soon. U.S. soldiers were on their way, but fighting wasn't the only way to die in such a massive global conflict. Who was the first U.S. soldier to die in World War II? Surprisingly, it wasn't in combat at all. His name was Robert Losey, an Iowa native who worked as an aeronautical meteorologist serving in Norway. While working to evacuate American diplomats from Norway, he was caught up in a bombing raid in 1940. He became the first American soldier to die on the European front over a year before Pearl Harbor happened. One unit of soldiers wore uniforms that would cause a double take, the 45th Infantry Division from the American Southwest. They all wore a pin with a proud eagle atop a swastika, a Native American good luck symbol. The Nazi symbol was commonly used among Native American groups, and no one raised an eyebrow until the 1930s. But there would be no mistaken identity when deployed, as by 1939, they replaced it with a Thunderbird symbol. It wasn't the only pre-war symbol that changed, as Hitler's private train was originally named America. Being the dictator came with advantages, as Hitler traveled in style on his own private mobile compound. It had a conference room, bedroom, and dining room, but its initial name America became awkward by wartime. The name was eventually changed to Brandenburg in 1943, as American forces targeted the train. Some changes might seem less essential, like America renaming hamburgers to Liberty Steaks during the war. America is a melting pot, with multiple generations of immigrants influencing its culture and language, including German words. As the country went to war with Germany, people were surprised to realize how many common words had German roots. Probably the most common example was the good old-fashioned hamburger, which got a name change to Liberty Steak. Of course it was the same dish, which made it all a little pointless and absurd. Food and drink could be oddly important to the war effort, as Coca-Cola showed its support for troops. During the war, U.S. manufacturing focused on essentials, making sure troops had ammo, armor, supplies, and soda. The Coca-Cola company set up manufacturing plants in North Africa to ship millions of bottles to soldiers. This allowed them to ship millions of bottles of Coke to soldiers, improving the company's image for years. But the tide of battle was turning, and it was getting bloody, especially on the Eastern Front. Hitler had made a critical misjudgment when he invaded Russia, as Napoleon could have warned him about. You never invade Russia. But neither side was prepared for just how brutal that front would become. The German forces were superior and inflicted massive casualties on the Russians with devastating effectiveness. Russia suffered a shocking 21 million casualties by the end of the war, an unprecedented loss. But they were fighting on their own turf, had superior numbers, and inflicted massive pain on the Germans. 80% of German casualties in the war came from the Eastern Front, a staggering concentration of losses. And as the war turned against him, Hitler became increasingly paranoid, turning on his own people. It was very common for him to turn on people who questioned him and cast them out of the party. Even elite Nazi officials like Werner von Braun found themselves on the outs in the last days of the war. Most famously, Hitler executed a shocking 84 of his generals over the course of the war. Although most of them were actually plotting against him, and can you really blame them for trying? Most famously, Hitler was nearly killed by his own men in Operation Valkyrie, the bomb plot. In the last year of the war, Hitler was becoming increasingly erratic, and his military inner circle believed he was sabotaging the war effort. For one thing, he kept on killing his own scientists who were developing crucial weapons and technology. Led by Klaus von Stauffenberg, a group of Nazi insiders planned to kill Hitler with a bomb at his secret compound. But a sudden change in seating arrangements led to the bomb only injuring Hitler, and most collaborators being executed. Even his renowned General Erwin Rommel was caught up in it, bringing a sudden end to his military career. Some of Hitler's plans were just genuinely bizarre, like weaponizing the Colorado potato beetle against Britain. The Nazis looked at weaponizing the Colorado potato beetle, a notorious pest that would devastate British potato crops. They would drop a mass number of the bugs on British farmland, devastating their food supplies and starving the island nation. But the plan was ultimately dropped for one reason. It wasn't feasible to collect the 40 million bugs needed. But there were some lines even Hitler wouldn't cross, as Nazi scientists developed deadly biological weapons. The Nazi scientists were hard at work on deadly biological weapons, including enhanced versions of typhoid and cholera. However, when they presented them to the Nazi leader, he didn't approve, and most projects never saw the light of day. What offended him about these plans? Hitler had no problem killing millions of civilians, but was a World War I veteran. That war had brutal biological and chemical warfare, and maybe it hit a little too close to home for him. But far more powerful weapons were in development. As rumors persisted about a Nazi atomic bomb project, it was one of the most persistent rumors after the war. Did the United States just barely beat the Nazis to the atom bomb? The answer is not really. The Nazis weren't close to finishing a nuclear weapon at all, but that didn't mean they didn't make progress on weapons of mass destruction with uranium and Japanese cooperation. The Nazis had uranium, and the Japanese could get closer to the US mainland to hit the West Coast with a uranium-packed conventional bomb. But the plan never came to fruition, and the German uranium may have eventually wound up in US hands. But across the ocean on the US mainland, development was heating up with the Manhattan Project advancing rapidly. Canada was ahead of the US in the war, in many ways, entering the Allied powers while the US was still neutral. They even had their own atom bomb project, with Britain called the Tube Alloys Project, before merging with the Manhattan Project. It would eventually merge with the United States Manhattan Project to speed up development, with both sides promising to share all their information. But the US didn't live up to its end of the deal, and it would be another 7 years before Britain successfully developed their own bomb. And ultimately, the first bomb detonated wasn't in combat. It was a test in the New Mexico desert. It took a lot of money and manpower to build the bomb, and the Allies wanted to be sure it would work before dropping it. The first successful test took place on US soil at a testing range in the New Mexico desert, and it horrified Oppenheimer. As Oppenheimer quoted a line from a Hindu sacred text, "I have become death, destroyer of worlds." But there was a twist to the first two bombs dropped. They were actually entirely different mechanisms. The first two nuclear bombs detonated in combat were nicknamed Fat Man and Little Boy, with different sizes and power. Little Boy was powered by the fission of uranium-235, while Fat Man used plutonium and was 40% more powerful. Now let's get into some truly shocking facts about the war, starting with the story of the good Hitler. William Patrick Stewart Houston was by all accounts a normal British lad who grew up in Liverpool and later served in the US Navy. But he had a secret. His father's name was Alois Hitler Jr., Hitler's half-brother from Austria. Not only would he fight for the United States against his mad uncle's empire, but he would be awarded the Purple Heart after being wounded in combat. Just another noble German American doing his part against the Axis powers, proving family doesn't define you. The Nazis used all sorts of unusual tactics to fund the war effort, including creating a fake bank account under a false name. The main purpose behind Nazi persecution of Jewish people was Hitler's obsession with race science and ideology. But the Nazis weren't above benefiting from it, looting money, gold, and jewelry from the Jews they arrested and deported. Because many countries were freezing the Nazis out of their banking systems, the SS created the Max Heiliger account to transfer assets undetected. But in some ways, the threat of the Nazi death machine outlasted the Nazis themselves, as seen at Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. The Bergen-Belsen concentration camp was a brutal and deadly place where countless people died, including Anne Frank. It wasn't an extermination camp, like some, but the rampant spread of disease and lack of medical care led to many casualties. When the camp was liberated in 1945, the plague typhus was so widespread, the Allies decided to burn the place to the ground. But amid the horror, there were heroes, as most countries invaded by the Nazis saw their Jewish communities rounded up and deported, but not Denmark, as Denmark had quickly surrendered to the Nazis and allowed themselves to be occupied peacefully. The lack of resistance meant the Nazis gave them more autonomy, giving Denmark several years before the Nazis began cracking down. And the Danes were able to smuggle the vast majority of their Jewish population to neutral Sweden.